Hi everybody, today we are going to go over how to eat better without spending more money, and it's not probably exactly what you were expecting. We are going to talk about cheaper ways to buy better food, but also the other health costs we don't really think about when we're not buying better food. So I really like this topic, super passionate about it. There's going to be a lot of visuals, a lot of graphs, and we'll go over each one. Let's get started. So quick review of today's agenda looking forward. So the problem of trying to eat healthier on a budget, I have 4 solutions to that I kind of posed, and so I broke it down into 4 sections. Solution number 1, we're going to look at why you want to eat in as much as possible as opposed to eating out, like at a restaurant or fast food. Solution number 2, we're going to talk about how to leave out the unnecessary items, what those might be, why that helps. Solution number 3, we are going to include better foods in smarter ways that are more affordable. And number 4, my personal favorite, we're going to talk about the extra healthcare costs that a lot of people tend to ignore if we don't decide to start eating better. So, looking at our solution number 1 of 4, we're going to talk about why eating in is really important as opposed to eating out. And I know people are going to expect me to compare, McDonald's obviously not as healthy as cooking at home. I don't have any slides on that because I think we can all agree that it is a lot easier to eat healthy when you're controlling the food that you're putting into your mouth, as opposed to going to a restaurant where, it might be a little healthier, but you don't know what exactly is going in there, what kind of oil is being cooked in, the quality of the meat, especially fast food. We know all that's definitely not as good. So what I want to talk about more than that is the cost and why, if maybe you don't care about eating as healthy, but I want to show that eating at home is still more affordable than eating out regardless. All right, let's look at some stats. These are fairly recent. These came out beginning of this year to back up kind of where we're going to head in this topic of eating out versus in. So approximately 70%, that's almost 3/4 of the American diet right now, consists of processed foods. And if you read studies, it's interesting. Processed food, they don't even call it food. A lot of times they call it food-like substance. And that's kind of just disturbing in itself. So we have whole foods, right? That's something you would find in nature. Our ancestors would know what that is. A processed food is something that takes processing to get it to look like something else and often tastes like something else. And there's a lot of magic going on behind the scenes. But right now, 70% of us eat processed foods every day. Sorry, 70% of the diet is processed foods. On top of that, Americans are allocating 10% of their disposable income towards fast food alone. This blew my mind. I had no idea it was actually this bad. So, disposable income is all the money that you have available at your disposal to spend on all your expenses, like your insurance, your mortgage, your car breaks down, you need gas, all this stuff. Yeah, some of that's going towards groceries, but 10% of that is going towards just fast food. And I thought that was quite a bit. Relating to that, 1 out of every 4 Americans consumes fast food on the daily. Now in Quincy, we're kind of lucky because we don't have a whole lot of fast food joints. But this does still include things like the Safeway Grab and Go, that's fast food, Polka Dot, things like Subway, Round Table, all of that. So 1/4 of Americans every single day, and that could be multiple meals, they are consuming fast food. So that's a lot. So before I get into this statistic, they didn't put it on here, but about 70% of Americans are overweight, and 1/3, in addition, are considered obese. So there's different levels, right? Your BMI, if you're healthy weight, then you get into the overweight range. And then obese is like a step above that, where it's a big red flag. So 1/3 of adults in our country are not just overweight, but obese. And just the obese, that third sector, results in an estimated annual medical cost of $147 billion for this country. That's a lot of money, resulting from something that arguably is a lot of times in our control. And what's most sad about this is not the adults, but when we look at the children around 19 and under, again, they don't even account for the overweight kids, but 17% of children are obese. And this has never happened. In the history of the US, children were not obese. They're growing, right? They have faster metabolisms than us. It's a lot harder for them to put on weight. Yet we have 70% of our adolescent and youth in this category, and that is unbelievable. So, like I said, I don't need to cover why eating out isn't as healthy as eating in, but we're going to take some of these statistics and look at where Americans are spending money, what happened, why we're moving towards fast food so much. All right, these two graphs kind of say the same thing. I have my little pointer, so I'm going to use this laser as I go over them. But super fascinating. So both these say the same things, just in different ways. On the bottom, almost on all these graphs, are going to be the years. So the left goes from 1997 to 2023, and this one extends a little bit longer, back to 1963. But let's look at the left one first. So we see complete inverse correlation. The red line is food away from home, and the percent, this number on the left, is the average household food expenditure. So the percent that each household is spending, towards their food money, and where that's going. So we can see 41% back in 1997 of the annual household food budget was going towards food away from home. That could be restaurant, that could be fast food, whatever. And a lot more was at food at home. And both of these just have had with a sharper dip right here around 2013, where they finally overlapped in 2017, and Americans were about spending 50%, so half and half food away versus groceries at home. And then we see this big dip. And it's no surprise that this is 2020. This is when COVID happened. It's cool because you're going to see a lot of graphs where COVID just threw this complete wild card. But so it makes sense, right, that we would stop going out to eat a little bit. We'd increase at home because people just weren't going out, things were closed. But then look what happened just 2 years later. Not only did we recover pre-COVID levels, but we continued shooting up. And so we are at the point now where we are, this graph shows basically the same thing. We are eating more away from home than we are food at home. And the trend of this graph, I'm not a statistician, whatever that word is, but we assume it's going to keep going up and up and up. All right, we're going to break it down now to the individual. This graph is really interesting. It goes over per person in the United States from 1953 to 2022, adjusted for inflation, where our food money annually is going. So this is not a household, this is like the average person, where that money and how much is going towards what source of food. So the blue sector at the bottom is food away from home, and the red at top is food away from home. And then if you add the two, you get the total amount. And we can see over time, what's interesting is we're not actually spending, and again, this is adjusted for inflation. So yeah, grocery prices are more now, but so is everything else, including income. So we can see, adjusted for inflation, that we're not spending more of a percent really on food away from home. After COVID, everything did increase. Super bummer, because it made everything more expensive. Not going to deny that. So we do see that peak there. But overall, it did not change a whole lot. But what did change is we look at how much people are spending percentage-wise at food away from home. And that's a really sharp increase. So now we can also see that we're spending much more, the average American, on food away from home than we are at food at home. And these kind of reinforce, these are a little older. It was really hard to find modern data and graphs visualizing some of this stuff. I feel like it's almost secret, like as if someone doesn't want you to know it. So it was really hard for me to find some newer data, but we can still see the trends happening, right? So in these pie charts up here, and it goes every 10 years from 1990 or 1970 to 2000, we have home cooking in red, and blue is our food budget spent on restaurant meals. So it's kind of the same thing over here, but we can actually see a lot more easily how that blue sector, percentage spent on food away from home, is just taking over. And I guarantee if this continued past 2000, that blue would be almost an inverse of this red one day. And then down here we have a graph, so we can obviously tell that we're eating out a lot more than we used to, likely due to convenience and whatnot. But when we eat out, this shows where we're spending that money. So sit-down restaurants are in yellow. Again, this stops at 2000, but we can kind of assume if the graph continued, it kind of is plateauing out at, and the left side shows number of meals a person eats per year. So when this ended in 2000, the average person was eating about 50 meals a year out. And that could be brunch, that could be dinner, it could be, it doesn't have to be expensive. But we look at the teal line, and that's fast food meals. It surpassed restaurant meals around 1985. And the end of 2000, it's at almost 90 meals a year per person. So it's double of restaurant meals. So yes, we're going out to eat, but the majority of that is fast food, which is a lot less healthy even than restaurant meals. All right, So an argument I hear a lot is, well, people probably eat out more fast food because it's a lot cheaper. But let's look at the actual price of groceries versus fast food right now. I love this chart on the left. This goes from 2014 to 2024, so like the last 10 years. And it tracks the percent of inflation, and I'll go over what that is, for some of the top nationwide fast food chains, everything from Subway and Starbucks all the way up to McDonald's. So we have in this highlighted yellow that I'm tracing right now, this is a graph of actual United States-wide inflation. It's increased 31% in the last, we're just going to say the last 10 years. And then we can see graphs of all the fast food chains and their percent of inflation, so how much their prices have increased since 2014. So we can see all the fast food is actually not following the nationwide trend of inflation, which doesn't make sense, right? It makes sense, inflation is going to happen. It does. When everything kind of goes up together, including wages and income. But the fact that fast food is growing disproportionately and way faster than our actual inflation rate is very interesting. So let's take the top one, McDonald's, which had the highest rate of inflation, 100%. So that means everything on average in their menu has doubled in the last 10 years. And over here on the left, we have just some menu items, and it shows the prices in 2014 versus the prices last year, and the percent increase. So a 10-piece chicken McNugget meal used to cost $5.99 in 2014. Now it's $10.99 before tax. So, and I think about this all the time, like, man, I remember when the Frosties at Wendy's, those used to be my favorite, were only like 99 cents, and now I don't buy fast food. I don't even know how much it is, but it's obvious to all of us, fast food prices are increasing at an exponential rate. So is it cheaper? Depending what you're eating, if you're just buying fries all day long, yeah, maybe, but based off these trends, and it's just going to keep continuing, it's going to keep getting more and more expensive. So I think we'll keep seeing that. So we looked at fast food, which is where most Americans are spending money on now, which is like convenient food. And let's look at the change in price of groceries. This chart goes way back to 1963, and it shows the share of disposable income, which we kind of mentioned before. So how much of your income that you have to spend on everything, how much are we spending that on food in the US? So the gray is the total amount we're spending on food, and we can see back in the 1960s, we spent almost 18% of our income on food. Now, total, we see a dip at COVID. People weren't eating as much. They're probably buying in bulk and eating smarter. And then prices of everything went up after. But in the last, almost 80 years, now we're only spending, what is that, roughly 12% on food, not even. So we actually spend less of our income on food in general. And then it does track food away from home. We can see that is increased. This is kind of like a zoomed out version of the previous ones we looked at. And food away from home is just severely declining. So it's interesting because yes, groceries seem more expensive, but we're actually not spending as much money on them as we think we are. So I just want to give this a little bit perspective. When I hear that argument that, I can't eat at home, I can't cook my own food for nearly as cheap as I can go out to McDonald's or whatever. And it's like, well, we're going to go over how we can do that. But the truth is, eating out is really not as cheap, at least as it used to be, or as we think it is. So I hope that kind of gave you some insight on the financial trends of the fast food and restaurant industry and where that might be heading. So let's look at solution number 2, which is the first step we would make. We have don't eat out, but then the next thing we should look at is leaving out unnecessary items. Let's give some stats on groceries in the US and spending. So the average, I think this was from 2023, these statistics, but the average American spends about $270 a week on groceries. And families with kids spend an average of $331 a week on groceries. No surprise, I looked at all the states because I live in California, but we are the most expensive state to buy groceries on with the average household, and that could be, single person, just a couple, family, whatever, but the average spends $297 a week on groceries. So here is, I feel like I'm going to say interesting chart like a million times a day, but I just love seeing data visual, and it makes a lot more sense to me than if I were just up here talking the whole time about this. But so from 1997 to 2022, we're going to look at spending just at food at home. So this is not eating out or anything, but if it actually is costing more than it used to. Again, adjusted for inflation. So this makes it fair, and we can actually compare, is the prices today as expensive as it was if you lived in 1997 comparatively. So we have the black dotted line. This is the total amount that we're spending on food at home. And yeah, it's going up. It's gone up about 50% since 1997. So we're spending 50% more on food at home. But let's see groceries is a light gray line. Look at where that grocery line is. It is on the 0%. That has not changed, little bump 2020, has not changed hardly at all. So where is that 50% increase coming from? We see these two giant lines right here. So let's break each of those down. The first one, the green one, warehouse. 1997 takes off. These are things like Costco, Sam's Club, businesses that have only really been around the last 10, 20 years and got really popular. People buy in bulk. And the reason our total spending went up is because before, you kind of just buy what you need, right? You go to a store, things are a little more expensive. I don't know if you've ever walked into Costco, but very rarely do you walk out only having what you actually need. You tend to spend a lot more, buy a lot more unnecessary stuff. It seems like, oh, it's too good of a deal to pass up. So we've started spending a lot more. And by 2022, we've increased 300% in the amount that we spend in places like Costco, which makes sense because they didn't really exist, but it did increase our spending as well. And then let's look at orange, which is home delivery services. 2012, that was kind of the advent of these things. Like most grocery stores now deliver, or you can go pick up, or HelloFresh. There's all these services now that you have, and that just steadily increased, kind of up here to this 325% range as well. So that might be also a little more expensive if there are fees involved with transportation, or if you have to spend over X amount of money for shipping and whatnot. So those two combined have increased the amount of money we spend at home. But again, if we look at groceries from like grocery store, we're not spending much more, actually, if any, than we were back in 1997. All right. One way to save then on groceries, if you're still not convinced that groceries are the way to go, is to leave out entirely our unnecessary items. And so before I go into what that is, I want to give you guys kind of some sobering statistics on how much junk food and unnecessary food we actually are buying in this country. So SNAP is a government subsidy that funds households that can't afford grocery bills. It gives them a certain amount of money to go buy food. So if we look at that, about 26% of SNAP households, and this was in 2016, so these have definitely increased by now. But back then, 22% of those households, their bill was spent on junk food, while non-SNAP households only spent 19%. So it's kind of interesting because those getting financial assistance were spending more on junk food than those just shopping regularly. And in this case, I define junk food as like snacks, candy, soda, chips, stuff that's not contributing in any way to nutrition or part of a meal and really not necessary. And looking at these baskets up here, this is kind of cool. On the left, we see all the junk food kind of categorized. And this is the amount that we have spent in this country on junk food. I don't know the exact year of this visual. This stat's from 2022, but I think this one is from the last couple of years. But $1.2 billion in this U.S. was spent towards these SNAP bills subsidizing this, and that just went straight to junk food. 1.2 billion of that, and you can see the breakdown. 138 million of that us taxpayers funded for these government programs was spent on candy. It almost makes me a little bit angry when I think about that. $609 million of our government spending was spent on sweetened beverages. And then 454 was on prepared desserts. None of this is something we need to survive, and none of it is doing anything good for our body. So when I talk about unnecessary items, this is kind of what I'm talking about first and foremost. And then we look over here, this sad little green basket. We only spent $782 million on fruits and vegetables compared to the $1.2 billion. So to kind of put that in perspective, in 2022, us as American taxpayers, all the taxes we pay, some of that money goes towards these programs like SNAP and WIC. We subsidize these junk food purchases to the tune of $26.9 billion. That blew my mind. And I'm like, we really need to think about our government programs and where that money is going. But it's clearly not going towards good food. So taking it away from looking at the country, and let's look in on ourselves for a bit. The average American spends about $850 a year on soft drinks. That's a lot of money. You could buy a lot of good food with that. And approximately $2,100 annually on coffee, which translates to about $175 a month. I thought that was crazy high. Didn't really make sense to me, but then you think about all the people who buy a $7, and then plus tip, Starbucks latte every single day, 365 days a year. And then you have your fancy creamers and your espressos and your K-pods and all this stuff. So I'm like, okay, yeah, it does make sense. But think of what you could do with $2,100. That's a crazy amount of money. So these are just two examples that are things that we could, and they're both drinks, funny enough, but to help us think about how we could put money towards good food that would have been spent on bad food instead. That's such an easy way to eat better with literally no extra cost. So there is no excuse, like I can't afford it, when you are able to actually leave out the bad stuff and include more good. So a really easy way for you to do this personally is to do your own personal cost analysis. And I encourage this no matter how good you think you are at shopping or how savvy you are, whatever. It's always good to know where your money is actually going. So for 1 month, I challenge you to keep track of all your food-related receipts. And then at the end, analyze what you spend in each category. So break it down into two, your essentials, which are your whole foods. Again, the things that look and resemble like real food from the earth. So your meat, dairy, your vegetables, fruit, minimally processed grains like oatmeal, rice, things like that. And then categorize your non-essentials. These are your processed foods, things that don't provide a lot of nutrients. You don't really get much out of them other than getting full on them. And that's your soft drinks like sodas, your juices, low nutrient snacks, things like crackers and fruit roll-ups, your desserts, alcohol, energy drinks, on and on. I could go on and on. So if you are really serious about eating better without spending more, the best place to start is by making these swaps within your own spending habits. It's easy to complain, oh, it's too expensive, I can't afford, the groceries I want. But when you look at what you're actually buying, that's just an excuse. There's a lot of swaps you can make. For example, if we buy a $5 bag, a big bag of chips, that's not really providing much of anything, right? If anything, it's providing a lot of bad stuff. It's just empty calories. It's processed. You're probably going to finish that like in a day or two. Like it's easy to snack on. As opposed to a $5 carton of spinach, like one of those big ones. You took that money on that bag of chips, put it towards that spinach. You get all of a sudden way more nutrients. It's unprocessed. That is straight from the earth. And you have probably I know I get at least 6 salads worth out of that carton of spinach. And it's hard. You can't eat the whole thing at once like chips because your body actually utilizes it. So there's a lot of cool swaps you could do. This is so cliche, but I absolutely have to say it. We are always what we eat. We need to think about food as an investment. We have the stock market, we have real estate, we have all of these things that we think we need to invest in, and health is often one that's often forgotten. When we don't invest in it, it's going to cost us later, and that's what we're going to get into. But really important to think about that as an equally as important investment as a 401k. Because not only is it investing into our future good habits, but that's our health, that's our happiness, and it's also our family's health and happiness, especially if you are the breadwinner, the provider, or you cook for your family, you're making those choices. Those children are going to grow up with those habits, and they learn from you as parents or guardians how you cook. And they eat what you make. They don't have a choice. So I'm not trying to put guilt on anybody, but it's an honor, but it's also a lot of responsibility if you are cooking and shopping for your family. And bottom line is, you're going to spend money on food, no matter what. We need to buy food to live. There's no way around it. So you might as well make that money count, right? And then I don't think this chart is from any data specifically, but it's a really good breakdown of what an average person's life might look like. So we talked about saving money in other parts of your grocery bill, but let's widen that. Let's look at your whole life and all your expenses in general. So you could take that cost analysis if you want and look at, okay, here's what I spent on gas for the month. Here's what I spent on clothes and Amazon and blah, 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 blah. And we can see where some of that money can be moved towards better food instead. So like this person, Here's our grocery sector. This is how much they spend on groceries. This is how much they spend on restaurants. And this is probably not too far off from a lot of people. And restaurant also being like fast food. If I just cut this in half and moved that block up to groceries, now all of a sudden I have about twice as much money to spend on groceries because I don't need to go out as much. But we can also do like, maybe I don't need to take that extra trip this year, or I don't need to go out to his movies as much, or I don't need to buy a shoe in every color. So there's a lot of things in our life outside of food that we can look at when we truly value buying good food and realize how important it is. So that kind of wraps up leaving out unnecessary items, which is the junk food we talk about. This is the easiest step you could do, again, besides just not going to eat out. And it has a ton of benefits without a whole lot of extra work. Our third solution, now we get into the part where we're including better foods in smarter ways. So let's start by comparing two diets. The first one is the standard American diet, or SAD for short, which I love that acronym. I think it is super ironic. It is arguably one of the least healthy diets in existence. It's what the average American eats. And it's also one of the most common in the United States right now. So that's going to be our bad example. And then our good example is going to be the Mediterranean diet. So I also shorten these down to SAD and MD. While not necessarily the perfect diet, Mediterranean diet, it is considered worldwide objectively to be one of the healthier. And it's a lot more common outside the US and other countries, but still fairly common here. So we're going to use these two to compare. That's going to be our healthy version. And because each have been around for a while and have been well studied and are pretty well known, I'm not just pulling random diets out or having to list a whole bunch of nutrients. We're just going to go off these two and compare them a little bit. So just so you're aware of what foods are in each diet and what we're actually comparing, I have the standard American diet breakdown on the right, a Mediterranean diet breakdown on the left. So let's look at the SAD diet. And this was from 2016. Now we know from our stats that processed foods, everything in orange, is closer to 70%. But still, this is all that junk stuff, sweeteners, added, bad fats and oils, things that are not contributing to our diet whatsoever. We have meat, eggs, and nuts. America eats way more red meat than pretty much every other country. We eat a lot less fruits and veggies. Look at that tiny little sad sliver of green. And then we eat a good amount of dairy still, but it's probably not healthy dairy. It's probably sugary yogurts and ice cream and gross cheeses and such. But compare this with the Mediterranean diet, we can see a huge difference. Look at how big this green sliver is. It goes from 8% to 30%, and a huge drop in meats and sweets. So meats meaning red meat specifically. They still include over here poultry, eggs. This is like healthy protein, seafood, all that kind of stuff. But meats and sweets, look at how small that is. It's only 5% as opposed to our 18 plus this 63%. And then they do prioritize healthy fats, especially olive oil in the Mediterranean diet, but it doesn't have to be just olive oil. And then their whole grains, their carbs are coming from a lot healthier sources like pastas, whole grain pastas, beans, not our refined flours and our sugary cereals and whatnot. So we're going to take those two pie charts and turn them into pyramids, which we all kind of have heard about, the food pyramid, which is a whole other topic for another day. But on the left, we have the Mediterranean diet pyramid. And so we see at the base, the foundation of this diet is fruits and veggies and whole goodness. On top, we have our protein and carbs, which is beans, legumes, seeds, high-quality carb sources. And we have some dairy, seafood, eggs. And at the very tippy top, we have maybe, our little treat. And I'm never going to be one to be like, you can never eat chocolate again. I don't believe in that. I eat chocolate, obviously. So at the very top, that's a treat thing, right? There's our 20%, here's our 80%. But there's our red meats, there's our sweeteners, there's our processed food. What's really fascinating is that the Western diet pyramid is a perfect flip-flop of the Mediterranean diet pyramid. Look at where our foundation is. And I know they do a lot of desserts, but this still stands for processed foods, things we don't need, junk food, and red meat. We eat a lot of that proportionately, followed by our dairy, eggs, cheese, seafood, all this stuff. And then we have our carbs, which usually are probably not the same type of carbs in the Mediterranean diet, but those are going to be our whole wheat white pastas, our white breads, our white everything, maybe a little bit of beans and seeds in there. And then maybe, just maybe, we'll fit in, some vegetables and fruit, maybe in the form of applesauce or a juice of sorts, but maybe as an afterthought. So we can see there's a huge difference in these two diets and what is included in each of them. So just to summarize, if we're aiming to eat more like the Mediterranean diet, we want to increase buying things like vegetables, fruits, the non-gluten grains I mentioned, healthy fats, things like avocados, olive oil, coconut oil, seafood, nuts, eggs, seeds, again, whole foods. And then we want to decrease those things that were the foundation of the standard American diet. That's your sugars, sweeteners, refined flours, cereals, your processed meats, all your bad seed oils, and your pasteurized milk. So rule of thumb, easy for this, when we're talking about eating healthier food, and you're like, what is healthier food? Rule of thumb for that, the closer a product is to its original form, found in nature, the better. But wait, isn't that going to cost more? So there's our second argument looking at this. If I'm buying more food like this on the Mediterranean diet, those stuff are more expensive than the stuff in the standard American diet. So let's look at that. And what I want to mention before I get into those is, let's look at the proportions real quick. The most expensive things in these two diets are probably the meats, but look at how little red meat is in the American diet as opposed to the standard American diet. And there's a lot of things on here like rice, which might be a good healthy whole grain. It's going to be a lot cheaper than your sugary cereals and fancy breads and whatnot. And then, leaving out this stuff. So just looking at the proportions at a glance as well, we can see the Mediterranean diet, if you're eating healthier, you don't need to buy as much of the more expensive things as we do as Americans. So just want to point that out. But let's take this idea of how to buy those healthier foods, those whole foods we talked about, in 10 steps. And these are to keep in mind that we are not aiming for perfection. We're just aiming for healthy. Right? I don't expect anybody tomorrow to be like, I'm dumping all of my food. I'm only buying organic from the farmer next door starting tomorrow. It's not going to happen. That's not realistic. You are going to get burnt out. It will be more expensive if you aren't prepared or don't know what you're doing. So here's some 10 tips we'll go through real quick for how to start making those alternatives to eat more like the Mediterranean diet and less like the standard American diet. Number 1, we're going to go for canned and frozen food, which I think gets overlooked a lot of times, but fresh produce can be expensive. I'm not going to lie, it can be. And it spoils a lot more easily. And I think about all the times I bought a giant thing of lettuce, and then 3 days later, you have to throw most of it away because there's no way you could eat it all in time. So this makes canned and frozen food actually a great alternative. Is it maybe not as great if they're in cans lined with BPA? Yeah, there's things we could talk about and argue, but all in all, I am way more for someone buying frozen spinach or canned spinach than they are not buying spinach at all. And honestly, especially frozen food, there's not a lot of difference in nutrients because it does preserve quite a bit. So feel free to go for these options that also last longer. You're not going to waste as much money, and they're just as good health-wise. Number 2, don't stress about organic or all the other certifications. I have to buy, non-GMO. Yeah, again, we could get into all those things, but just taking that step towards buying whole and real foods over processed foods, that's a huge one. That's the best thing you could possibly do. And it is going to make a huge difference in your health. You will feel it. You will notice the difference. So don't worry about all the fancy stuff. Just go for the things that actually look like food for now. And then we're going to buy in season. This is something that's really overlooked in our modern world. And the reason I say buy in season is because produce that is in season in your local area, so like for me, California, it's going to be priced lower naturally because the shipping's less, it's closer, there's a lot more of it, it's easier to get, it's local, as opposed to buying out of season. So the reason it's more expensive to buy out of season, but why we totally can, in America at least, in the 21st century, I can have a watermelon in December if I want, and I can have a winter squash in July if I want. But back in the day, that would never happen. You get what you get certain times of the year, certain plants, certain vegetables only grow certain times, and that's great. And you just have to wait for it to be the right time again. But now, thanks to shipping and worldwide ag and all the amazing resources we have, you can get any fruit, vegetable, meat, product, anything you want at any time of year. Even if it's completely out of season, there are ways to grow them or in greenhouses artificially. And so that kind of creates a problem because it's going to be more expensive. You're thinking about, I have to ship this pineapple now all the way from, the other side of the world versus when it's in season closer in Hawaii. So something to keep in mind. But what's also cool, it's like God knew what he was doing, I guess, when he designed our bodies. But when you eat in rotation like this and you're buying in season, it encourages you to eat more variety of things because you have to rotate them. And that actually is super healthy for our gut and our microbiome. When you eat the same thing every single day, you can actually decrease the amount of diversity in your gut, and it leads to a higher propensity to get allergies, food allergies. So I actually used to eat eggs, actually bad quality eggs, I'll admit. Growing up, like every single day, I'd eat 3 of them. I don't have an egg allergy. I never did, but I ate so much of them every single day, never gave my body a break, that I started to react a little bit to them. And all I did was have to back off a little and kind of add them in rotation. So now I try to buy, same with vegetables, when things are in season, and it works a lot better. Number 4, we're going to look at the stores and brands that we're shopping from. This sounds so silly, but it really makes a difference. But a pound of walnuts we buy at Safeway, don't sue me Safeway, is going to cost a lot more than buying a pound at Save More. So where you shop, you don't have to go to the Whole Foods, which would be my dream one day. I can't even afford that. So don't have to go to the fancy supermarkets. There's also nothing wrong with generic brands. I actually very rarely buy name brand foods. I highly prefer generic. Same, if you compare the two, oftentimes, same exact thing, just generic is cheaper. Number 5, we're going to go bulk. And I know we talked about Costco earlier in one of those slides, but nothing wrong with Costco as long as you are buying things that don't spoil and you're going to use and actually make sense. This is actually really helpful with things really expensive like meats and seafood. I know if I find a deal on something when I'm shopping, especially something expensive like shrimp I did the other day, I buy a lot more than I normally do and I freeze it. And yeah, it costs a little bit more up front, but I'm going to spend it anyways later down the road, so that does make a good amount of sense. All right, continuing our list, number 6 is meal prep. And I have a couple of these up here if you'd like to take a look at them, but I live for meal prep cookbooks. I love them. I'm not a cook. I am not a baker. I don't like cooking. I'm not good at shopping. This is not my thing, which is ironic. But I came into the world of meal prep, and I use these cookbooks, and basically what it does is it gives you a week-by-week breakdown. So for the week, it'll give me a grocery list, tell me exactly what I need to buy, exactly how much, and then a couple recipes to incorporate those for the week so you don't get sick of the same thing. You might have 4 different recipes from this list. And it ensures that you have 0 waste, you don't buy anything extra, so super good if you're trying to be money savvy. And you only buy exactly what you need. Highly suggest. You can buy them for gluten-free diets, keto diets, low carb, like there's one for everything online. Highly suggest looking at. Number 7, go with a plan. If you're not meal prepping, at least have some kind of a plan. You might have heard the stats already, but it is proven that if you go shopping without any sort of list or plan, you are going to have more impulse buys. And those impulse buys are things that are worse nutritionally and are probably unnecessary, things you don't need. And especially, I didn't include it in here, but don't go shopping when you're hungry. Like you're going to buy things that are high in sugar, high in carbs because you're hungry, you're hangry, you're cranky, you want that energy. So make sure you go with a list and a full tummy. Number 8, pick the right ingredients. This is kind of an easy, obvious one, but there's no need to buy a $5 pineapple to be fancy trying to get your variety and whatever and do a certain dish. When grapes are, in season, they're on sale. So a lot of this eating better at a lower cost is just being smart and being flexible. It also means you're going to have to try new foods probably, especially if you're not used to Whole Foods. You might have to learn to cook. You might have to learn to do a lot of things. But honestly, and you can call me a year from now and tell me I'm wrong, but I think you're going to end up really liking it. Number 9, we're almost done with this list. Take it gradually. Again, like I said at the beginning of this, we're not going to change everything at once. I don't expect that. It's going to be overwhelming. It's not going to be sustainable. People are going to give up and it will never work and be like, oh, well, that didn't work. So the trick is you need to do it gradually. So try maybe every week. We talked about keeping out unnecessary and adding good. Just take out one thing. You realize, oh, I buy soda or bubbly waters every week. I don't really need those. Maybe let me keep that out this week and instead add something else. And then as you do it, think about when you're buying that, making that decision consciously at the grocery store, at the checkout. Just keep in mind, you're making this shift for yourself, and savor the feeling of treating your body kinder. This is the utmost self-love you could do, is to fuel your body with the best fuel possible. So know that you are doing this out of a place of love, and your body is going to be very, very grateful. And finally, aim for simplicity. I think, especially as a not fan of cooking myself, I get intimidated by cooking, and I think it has to be all this fancy stuff. My fiance, who's very excellent at cooking, can whip something up that tastes amazing and puts these ingredients together. I don't know how to do that, right? You don't have to be a chef like that. You can just cook up a big pot of rice in a rice cooker. You don't even have to know how to cook rice. Steam some veggies, microwave, even frozen veggies, I don't care. And then get some roasted chicken thighs. That simple dish alone, super substantial. You're gonna get a lot of nutrients out of it. It's gonna feed a big family, and it's probably gonna cost less, or at least on par, with most fast food meals, definitely cheaper than restaurant meals, and even most frozen dinners. You look at frozen dinners now, and they're so expensive, and you get hardly anything out of them. So just keep it simple. What is that acronym? KISS? Keep it simple, stupid? Yeah. All right. So wrapping up, adding in more beneficial stuff, let's look at some resources, places we can look to specifically for help. One is Thrive Market. This is an online grocery store that gives you access to certain health foods at a cheaper price, and they ship it right to your door for free as long as you have over a certain amount. This is really great if you live in a food desert, and a food desert is somewhere like an inner city or super rural where you don't really have access to health foods or maybe grocery stores at all, because these places really do exist. Now, the thing is, there's an annual subscription, and I love this, I love the owners and their motto, you can still apply for a free subscription if you aren't able to afford it. You just go online. I think you have to submit an application, explain your situation, but they're trying to make good food affordable for anyone, no matter where you live. They're going to take the difficulty of reaching it out of the equation, period. So super cool to look at, Thrive Market. Misfits Market, another online grocery store. This one is less available. It's only in certain United States cities. Don't think it's here in Quincy, but if you or a relative live somewhere else, it has it all listed on their website where they do deliver. This is super awesome. And what they do is they take all, as the name implies, all the misfit produce from a store that doesn't make the cut. If you go to a grocery store and you look at the fruits and veggies, you notice there is not a single apple with a bruise. Every pepper, red bell pepper, is absolutely perfect. Everything looks perfect. If you've ever grown vegetables yourself, which I have, and at first I was like, I am doing something wrong, but the truth is they don't turn out that pretty normally. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Things like blemishes or cuts or just grows funky or there's twins. Does not mean there's anything wrong with the food whatsoever, but because Americans were used to perfect food, if we saw that in the grocery store, we'd be like, oh, there's something wrong with that. So this company takes all this waste, and literally a lot of it just becomes trash, which breaks my heart. So they take this and then they reship it out to people at a lower cost who need it. Love it. Third, we talked about the not so great part of SNAP earlier, and WIC and other food assistant programs. But truth is, if you have a really low income and you do honestly need help, there is nothing wrong with food stamps. I don't judge whatsoever. Just make sure if you're spending them, it's going towards stuff that is actually going to support and nourish your family. The regulations right now are very few. I don't think you can buy alcohol, tobacco, things like that. But they also are pushing, I don't know where it is in legislation right now, to remove soft drinks and highly processed foods from the future. So that those billions, $22 billion in fast food amounts that we spend. Oh, yeah, absolutely. That you spend would go towards that. And finally, this is just one website you can use, but the MyPlate, which is a government website, just type in USDA. They have an app, and they have a lot of information that help you shop smarter. They give you ideas for meal prep and other resources. And in fact, this is just a general push. Like, you're watching this, right? You're already one step ahead, but learn as much as you can. There's a lot of free knowledge, and if money is an issue, that's really no excuse here. You have YouTube, you have a million online articles, you have websites like this. knowledge is going to equal savings. And the more you learn, the more you invest in knowledge as well, the more you're going to save. And I think, I don't know who said this, but the biggest asset, the best asset you could ever invest in is yourself and your knowledge and what you know. So empower yourself. The more you know, the more you'll save. And finally, you can speak with me. If you are watching this and you really are struggling, you want to eat better, you really are on board, you want to do better, but there's just no way. You said there's no way there's any chance that I can afford to do that. And I need help, but I can't get it. Absolutely reach out to me. I have all my contact information on my website, and I will work with you free of charge to get you started on the right path, because nothing makes me more sad when someone wants to eat well and be healthy and doesn't know where to start or does not have the resources. So I'm not going to let that be an excuse. All right, to wrap up this third solution, let's look at a couple arguments and kind of summarize what we've talked about. So if someone said, well, it's more expensive to live on the Mediterranean diet than the standard American diet, which we kind of disproved, I would rebuttal with calories are not the same as nutrients. So please understand that eating cheap, eating more affordable, you're not eating to fuel your body. You're eating just to not feel hungry. If I go to McDonald's and I load up on gross carbs and bad vegetable fats every day, my body's not getting anything out of that. I am just eating so I don't have to feel hungry. And the sad part is eating bad food like that is going to actually keep you feeling hungrier longer and more often, because your body is still like starving and says, please give me, I'm still hungry. I don't have any vitamins or minerals. So you feel as a human like, oh, I'm hungry again. I need to eat. You eat, but your body's still, where's those vitamins and minerals? It's not getting what it needs. Truth is, the standard American diet is higher in calories, but it's still lower in nutrients than a Mediterranean diet. So you could think about this. Do you want to put more money towards calories, or do you want to put your money towards nutrients? Something to think about. Second argument, but processed foods can still be fortified with, vitamins and minerals and fiber and stuff. And you see that a lot, especially in cereals. I don't know what it is about cereals. They're trying to push this, which is basically a dessert, on as a health breakfast food. And they'll always say fortified with something. So the rebuttal is that the source of the nutrient does matter. What's cool about biology is that without even thinking about it consciously, our bodies already understand how to read and use nutrients that are found in whole foods. So if you were in the wild, you came upon, a carrot growing in the ground and you ate that, your body would immediately recognize that, oh, that's a carrot. I know the components. I can break this down. I can use it. I know the vitamins. I know the minerals. I know the carbs, blah, blah, blah. There's no tree making Lucky Charms out there in the wild. So if you came upon that, your body is like, what is in this? I have no idea. Especially if you're not used to it, you're not going to feel good whatsoever. And that alone should be a big key. But if we think about vitamins, minerals, and foods that are fortified with this stuff, taking that, when they're isolated like that or added, a lot of times from a lab or some weird source, our body does not understand what that is or where it's coming from. Even though you might be ingesting added, calcium, vitamin D, you're probably not absorbing or utilizing nearly as much as you would be if you got those from just your diet. There's a big misconception that we need vitamins, over-the-counter multivitamins, things like that. We need those to survive. The truth is, we can get a lot of those if we just eat a good, healthy diet. There might be some things like vitamin D. We don't get as much sunlight as we should. But for the majority, you don't need to be spending on all this extra stuff if you just eat good. So honestly, you're saving money on vitamins too, and all your multivitamins you were, if you just spend money on whole foods. All right, last argument. Oh, I'll just eat better later, when I can afford it. I'll do X later when I can afford it for a lot of things, right? The rebuttal is, okay, that's great, but what you're eating right now is going to create who you are later, which we're going to look at next. That's going to wrap up our talk. But if you're eating poor now, by the time you can afford to eat better, guess what? Your body has already had an onslaught of all these issues. You could be overweight. You might have become pre-diabetic or taken on type 2 diabetes. You might have several chronic health issues or worse. It is a lot harder and more expensive to reverse something after than it is to prevent and be healthy in the first place. So that wraps up our third section of including our better foods in smarter ways. And let's move on to our last solution, which is considering the extra healthcare costs related to a poor diet. So we're not looking at the food itself anymore, but all the other costs related to food that people often ignore. And let's start by looking at the state of health in America. Here are two wonderful, opposing, mind-boggling graphs. So national health care in the US, spending on that reached $4.9 trillion in 2023, almost 15,000 a person, which was a 7.5 increase from the year before. And we know with COVID, there's going to be an increase in spending. This is kind of a little after, COVID was still around, but it wasn't, the heart attack that it was before. That's a huge increase. And 4.9 trillion, that is a lot of money. So this top graph, it takes a lot of the world's more developed countries, including the US, and it rates our per capita spending on healthcare. So we see all, Japan, Italy, Norway, they all spend, a good amount on healthcare. And then here's the US. What the heck are we doing? We're at 70, we're like a third higher than the second highest country. That's not just, a little increase, that's a huge jump. So we spend more by far than any other developed country, any country period, on healthcare. So we should have the best healthcare in the world, no? Well, if we look on the left, and this ranks a lot of the same developed countries in their healthcare, and they take a lot of things into consideration, like infant mortality and healthcare equity and access to healthcare, things like that. So it's not just how many people are dying. They look at healthcare in general and how good of a system we have. So we spend the most. We should be number one. No, we are literally the last ranked country of all the developed countries for our overall healthcare ranking. And something is just not adding up, right? Especially for spending $5 trillion, which is more now, on it. So what is going on? What's sad, if we look at, we zoom into our country now, just looking at the US, the generation alive right now, so I'm 31, so my generation, is the first ever predicted to not outlive our parents' life expectancy. This is really heartbreaking. These graphs say the same thing. I just found two different ones, and I thought they were both pretty, so I included them both. But let's look at the one on the left. This is ranking from 1980 up to 2020. So they're not super recent, but I promise you it has not gone back to pre-COVID levels, as we'll see. But this gray line is the average country lifespan. And back in 1980, we were kind of pretty close. America's the red line. Other countries, or the average, is the gray. So we're around 74, 75 years. By 2020, the worldwide country average is 82.4 years. So yeah, we've all kind of done good, which makes sense, right? We learn more, we have more access to technology, we should be increasing that. But what happened with the US? So again, this dip at 2020, 2019 with COVID, we see the average, yeah, they took a little dip, but they came right back to where they were. What happened with the US? We hit COVID and then just did not recover. So we actually, in 2020, and this is not as recent as I liked, but we are at 76-year estimated lifespan, and other countries average 82.4 years. That's a big gap. That's a 6-year gap. There's clearly something very, very wrong going on here. So let's look at why. Why are we as a country failing our society and our healthcare system? So we're going to look at how there's a correlation between the increase of processed foods, which is, that big orange section on the standard American diet. It's all that junky food we don't need. Why there's such a big correlation between that and obesity, diabetes, and chronic health issues, which is contributing greatly to the decline in our healthcare and in our life expectancy. This graph is awesome. It tracks diabetes and obesity levels. You'll see it's kind of confusing, but diabetes is on the bottom, and it's 10 years offset of the obesity rates on the top. And they did that on purpose to kind of overlay, because there is a hesitation. Someone becomes obese, right? They don't immediately get diabetes right then. They then develop diabetes. So they kind of did a time lapse and then pushed the two graphs together to show that correlation without the lag. So we can see obesity rates just absolutely skyrocketing. Obesity prevalence going from, not that bad, slow incline around 1995 when the low-fat diet stuff kind of took off and things were high carb, more processed, all that was happening. Now, or I don't say now, in 2010 it was around 24% obesity. We know now that it's around, oh, I'm looking at the wrong one. There we go, 30%. That makes a lot more sense. So, and if we look at the diabetes rate, following that 10 years later, it's just a little bit slower, it increased the exact same. So there's clearly a correlation there between obesity and diabetes. And we want to blame a lot on genetics and genes and whatnot, but there's more and more studies coming out that are showing maybe only 5% of our genes are responsible for any sort of chronic disease and all that. And there's a lot more that goes into nurture than does nature. And I think a lot of us are just trying to put the blinders on to that, but we cannot ignore it if we want to get better and healthier as a nation, especially for our kids and future generations. So taking these graphs into account, let's jump over here and see why this is happening. This is a trend in just dietary fat. So it looks at the different fat sources that we're consuming in the United States over the years up to 2020. And it breaks them all down. The dashed line right here, this is obesity rate, and we can see that on the right. So there we are ending at, 34%, wherever that is. And here's most of our fat sources. These lines over here, the blue, the teal, the green, the yellow, these are our dairy, our animal fats, our beef, our pork. Those things we are not increasing in calories per day more now in 2020 than we were back in 1960. If anything, we're doing less. The only fat that increased, this red line, is vegetable oils. And those are our trans fats, our hydrogenated, our partially hydrogenated oils, the really, really bad things for us. But we can see that's the only fat that's increased in consumption right along with that obesity rate. And we can see there's also a lag too, because it started increasing a little bit earlier, and it takes a while for things to catch up, right? But then not long after, there's that obesity line. So it's in the data. You can see graph after graph after graph and just saying the same thing. So now that we kind of understand that eating poorly is having a huge effect on our diet, let's look at what those costs might be exactly. So there is a lot of expense. Some of you might know this firsthand, but with surgeries and recoveries, especially related to heart disease, which is people call it the number one killer in the United States. The sad thing is that a lot of these instances are avoidable, and it is a lot diet and stress related in our lifestyle. And if we could focus on those two things, we would avoid a lot of surgeries, bypasses, stents, all that stuff, and a lot of deaths and heart attacks if we could focus on food first. And then, of course, there are the health risks associated with becoming obese and taking on type 2 diabetes, and you might be on insulin for the rest of your life. That's not going to be cheap. None of that's going to be cheap. You might have to depend on a prescription med, potentially lifelong. There's new weight loss things. I'm not going to say brand names because I don't want to get in trouble, but they want you to be on it for the rest of your life. You go off of it, you go right back to where you were before, but guess who's making a lot of money on that? It's not you. And then the one that hits me the hardest is that we are aging a lot quicker. And we talked about how this generation is not going to live longer on average than our parents' generation, but what's also important to realize is that we might still be living longer than we did 100 years ago, but the problem is we are dying a lot longer. So I think about people I know who are older and the quality of life they have, and it's really not that great. And when this generation grows up, it's going to be even worse, right? Because we're not taking care of our bodies. They're going to have all these chronic autoimmune diseases and cancers and be overweight. You think that quality of life is going to be really awesome? Everybody wants to save for retirement and be like, oh, I'll just travel. Last 10 years of my life, they probably won't be healthy enough to travel. You're not going to feel good enough to travel or have the money because you need to be on all these treatments or medications. And that's just a hard truth of it all. And the problem is if you die longer too, which is like this slow, sad decline from poor health, it requires a lot more expenses. Thinking about all the nursing facility stuff you have to do, those are not cheap. You might need transportation if you can't drive anymore. You need a wheelchair. You can't move around, an electric motor chair. Towards the end of life, hospice care, very expensive. And then also hospitalization, obviously the most expensive of all. And then eating bad is going to obviously, and it has, there's more stats. I felt like we had enough graphs for today, but is going to increase the chance of developing chronic diseases like autoimmune diseases and cancers, which have just skyrocketed in the last several years, and understandably why after this presentation. But each of those, and even just with feeling bad and things that are like IBD, IBS, leaky gut, things that we can't even blame on anything specific, is just unwellness, right? All those things have side effects. And a lot of them require a doctor or hospital visits, specialist care. It really adds up a lot. And then something really not looked at a lot is how it takes a toll on us mentally and emotionally, right? If you're gaining weight, it's kind of hard to deal with that emotionally. And honestly, it creates this negative feedback loop where people tend to eat more than, and just makes it worse. And it creates insecurities. You might have to deal with a diagnosis. That's really hard to do. If a doctor tells you, hey, you might have cancer here, that's going to take a huge mental toll. Or diagnosis of a loved one. They tell you your wife has, this really incurable autoimmune disease. That's hard. And just in general, losing that ability to thrive or to feel good, or looking back and being like, I can't remember the last time I felt good, last time I slept good. That takes a huge mental toll. And your emotions, therefore, are also going to affect your physicalness, and it's going to make you feel worse. It's just a terrible snowball, but I don't want to forget that the mind is behind all of this as well. So, my last argument, why good food is worth it. Number one, the U.S. spends more on healthcare, we saw that, than any other sector in our country. This means, including Social Security and military defense. We spend more on healthcare than we do military and Social Security. And then we spend more than any other country per capita, yet we have the worst healthcare and the worst health conditions of all the developed countries. 2, there's a big focus on treating symptoms of diseases with medicine and surgery, rather than finding the root cause and treating the actual disease itself, which includes preventing it, period, right? It's a lot easier and cheaper and a lot less stressful for you if you never get diagnosed with a disease or have to take something on, like that burden, period. And I don't want to blame doctors entirely. You go to modern medical school, they're very good at treating how to fix problems with medication and surgery. It's not really their fault, it's just what's being taught. So that's why I took it upon myself to figure out how to treat root causes in a holistic sense. But I think we're going to see a trend moving towards more of that, especially maybe even being offered in healthcare scenarios and insurance. Maybe one day health coaches will be allowed on insurance claims, but obviously something's not working. So we need to start taking it into our own hands and looking outside of tradition. Number 3, why good food is worth it. Finding the cause of a disease and addressing it directly will prevent future costs of being on those lifelong meds, the cost of surgeries, everything I mentioned in the previous slide. Not to mention, you're going to have such a better quality of life, and you won't have all these weird side effects and unknown consequences. Keep in mind, there are a lot of drugs coming out that have not been out for a long time. And by a long time, I mean it could take decades for something to sink in. And we literally don't know the side effect of some of the things that are happening. But remember, spending money on food now, that good food, is going to save you money and quality of life in the long run. When I say investment, yes, there might be some small, you might have to spend a little bit more now if you really truly want to eat better, although I think you could still manage by not having to spend more. But in the long run and overall, it's going to be so worth it, not only financially, but to me, there's nothing more important on earth than your health, because without your health, you can't work, you can't enjoy your relationships, you can't travel, you can't enjoy your time with kids. So my health comes first. And finally, the best way to treat a disease or prevent it entirely, I truly believe, is by eating healthy. Because food is the one thing we have more control over, right? I can say what goes in my mouth as an adult, at least, not as a kid, but as an adult, more than anything else related to my health. I can't control the smog in the air. I can't control global warming. I don't even want to go into that. I can't control a lot of things, the toxic people around me, the news, the stress from this and that, but I can control what I eat and don't eat. So just remember, it's all about education. Look past all the marketing, because all these companies are super savvy. They want you to buy their thing. They're going to make it seem healthy, make it seem good. Watch my past seminar on how to read food labels, and I go into that a little bit, but we have to love ourselves enough to commit to these new habits. Yeah, it's not easy. It's hard, but it's going to be so worth it. Absolutely promise that. So that wraps up our fourth solution by considering healthcare costs related to a poor diet. So that's all we got for today, guys. I know that was a lot of information and a little bit of a sobering message, but this is really serious. It's a big problem in the United States, and it has only gotten worse in the last decade. So I sound like a broken record when I talk to people about, oh, you be eating good food, eating better, da-da-da. But this is why. And you can point them to this seminar and this video if you don't want to tell them yourself. But if you had any questions on what we talked about or want to go any deeper into anything, here is my information. You can reach me at any time. Probably email is preferred. And I appreciate you guys for sticking through this whole seminar. And I hope you have a happy, healthy day. Thank you.